At the recruitment post, at the foot of Qingyun Sect, the crowd was packed shoulder to shoulder. Commoners from every direction craned their necks and waited, hoping to find even a menial labor job in this sacred gate of immortals. Joseph, an American who had transmigrated into this Chinese cultivation world, stood among them. Even though he tried to hunch in and make himself small, his broad body and towering height still made him stand out. At a glance, his blazing golden hair shone strangely under the harsh sun. What unsettled the people around him even more were his deep sea blue eyes. Steward Wang Cheng was flipping through the registry in bored silence, but when he looked up and saw Joseph's face clearly, the laziness in his eyes froze at once and turned into naked disgust. What kind of thing is this? Wang Cheng slammed the table and jumped up, pointing at Joseph and shouting in his face. Joseph had not even managed to explain himself. Under extreme tension, his clumsy command of the language broke apart into a few stiff, fragmented sounds. Wang Cheng let out a sharp sneer and shouted loudly to the surrounding disciples, "Look at this thing, a white-haired beast that crawled out from who knows where and cannot even speak like a person. An uncivilized animal like this dares come to Qingyun Sect looking for work. Why does he not look at himself first? Those blue eyes are clearly the mark of a calamity star. If he stays near the mountain, he will only ruin this sect good fortune." As Wang Cheng stirred them up, the nearby disciples and onlookers joined in and started jeering. Someone threw a sharp broken stone first, and it struck Joseph in the forehead. Blood ran down through his golden hair and across that sharply cut foreign face, making the sight even more shocking. Then stones began to rain down on him. Joseph did not fight back. His body was full of explosive strength, yet in the middle of their laughter he looked awkward and lowly. He lowered his head and turned away in silence under the stream of curses. Calling him a beast, he tried to leave this place, filled with hostility. Trying to leave, not that easy. A cruel light flashed through Wang Cheng's eyes. An odd creature like this would be a danger. Even if it stayed in town, release the dogs, drive this beast into the wild hills. Several savage barks exploded at once. Two black-scaled spirit hounds, as tall as half a man, broke free of their chains and lunged at Joseph. They tore into his legs and back in a frenzy, ripping away strips of flesh. In an instant, Joseph staggered into a run while enduring the agony. With nowhere left to go, he was forced to leap into the foul, stagnant ditch outside town. Cold mud, thick with the stench of rot, swallowed his mouth and nose, but it also cut off the spirit hound's pursuit for the moment. When Joseph clawed his way out of the sludge, he barely looked human anymore. His golden hair was plastered over with black mud like a heap of dead grass. Dragging his mangled body, he stumbled through the bleak dusk toward the slum district on the edge of town. That was the darkest, filthiest corner in the whole town, and the gathering place of those completely abandoned by civilized society. Beside a straw shack that looked ready to collapse at any moment, Joseph finally dropped from exhaustion as his awareness blurred. A thin, shriveled hand covered in festering sores trembled as it held out half a moldy, stale cake. Joseph forced his eyes open and saw an old beggar curled up in the shadow. The old man gave off a nauseating stench from head to toe, but in his eyes there was a bleak sorrow of someone who recognized another sufferer in this cultivation world, where anything different was treated like grass. Underfoot, a blonde, blue-eyed beast and a dying old man began to have their fates entwined in the filthy mud. Morning in the slum district always came with the stench of rot, the groans of despair. But today that dead silence was ripped apart by a burst of shrill laughter. 3 teenage outer sect disciples of Qingyun Sect were kicking and stomping Molao in the corner like they were driving livestock. This old man, who had once shared half a moldy, stale cake with Joseph in the mud, now clutched his head and rolled in the filth in pain. Stop! A low, angry shout came from the shadows, rough and slightly unsteady in the local tongue. Joseph's broad body stepped in front of Molao. His golden hair was clumped with grime. The old wound on his forehead was still bruised purple, but his blue eyes were locked on the cultivators in front of him. Well, look at that. Is that not the white-haired beast? The leader Zhao Kun raised a brow, and his eyes were full of mockery. He had already been itching for somewhere to vent his temper. Now this freak actually dared to step up, and his cruelty surged at once. Without warning, Zhao Kun whipped up a kick and slammed it into Joseph's chest. Joseph muffled, grunt, but he stood there like an iron tower rooted into the ground and did not move at all. What a build! It would be a waste not to use it for kicking practice. Zhao Kun grinned viciously and signaled the two disciples beside him to pin Joseph down. Joseph was strong, but he was still only flesh and blood. Under the pressure of spiritual qi, they forced him face down into the mud. Zhao Kun walked slowly to him, then raised his boot and ground it down hard on Joseph's right hand that was bracing against the ground. The crisp crack of breaking bone sounded especially terrifying in the dead alley. With a sharp snap, Joseph's index finger, middle finger, and ring finger twisted and shattered under the hard soul. Pain surged through his whole body like a flood. Cold sweat soaked his back in an instant. But he did not make a sound. His blue eyes only grew colder. They looked like a frozen abyss, sealed for 10,000 years, filled with a deathly resolve that chilled the heart. That stare made Zhao Kun feel a flicker of fear. Humiliated and enraged, he actually untied his belt in front of everyone. A hot, foul stream splashed over Joseph's crushed fingers, and his golden hairlock gutter burst out all around them. In that moment, the cultivator's pride was fed by trampling a freak beneath their feet. By nightfall, inside the leaking straw shack, Mo Lao was breathing like a candle in the wind. He trembled as he reached out his thin hand and touched Joseph's eyes, which were still cold as iron. A fierce light exploded in his cloud. Why? Gaze like never before. Child, this world leaves no road for the weak. Mo Lao coughed up a mouthful of black blood from inside his clothes. He pulled out a tiger bone jade token, smooth as tallow yet faintly soaked in savage killing aura. Using the last of his strength, he shoved the token into Joseph's mouth by force. When his fingertips brushed Joseph's shattered hand, a final hard resolve flashed through the old man's eyes. This is White Tiger Fist, utterly hard, utterly blazing. Kill every false saint. Mo Lao's voice cut off at once. That hand covered in festering sores dropped to the ground without strength. Joseph held the cold jade token in his mouth and felt a violent current of heat spreading across his tongue. He knelt before the old man's body and did not cry. Only his golden hair seemed to give off the ferocity of a beast in the dark. In that moment, the sleeping bloodline inside him from a foreign land seemed to answer the tiger bone and let out its first low roar. Rain on the barren mountain was cold as ice spikes. With those fingers that had been crushed under a boot, Joseph dug into the hard earth inch by inch. His fingertips were already mangled flesh mixed with mud. He felt none of it. He only buried Mo Lao again and again with stubborn hands at the grave. He knocked his head to the ground 3 times. A faint light flickered in his blue eyes in the dark. That was the last dignity he still held. As a man, he swore he would carry Mo Lao's final wish and live like something in this world that devoured the weak. But the sunlight the next morning brought no hope. When Joseph dragged his exhausted body back to the barren mountain, his heart nearly stopped at what he saw. The grave had been dug open. With brute force, fresh soil was scattered everywhere. Mo Lao remains were already gone. Beside the broken tombstone, someone had carved bloody words into a rock. A beast does not deserve burial. The rage he had been crushing in his chest exploded completely. In that instant, he followed the chaotic footprints and ran toward the Qingyun Sect gate like a madman beneath the archway. The place was packed with people. Countless disciples were pointing upward and laughing with sickening delight. Joseph looked up. His blood almost froze solid. Mo Lao's ruined corpse had been pierced through the spine with a rusted iron hook and hung naked beneath the blazing sun. It swayed in the wind like a piece of rotten meat. Thrown away, Steward Wang stood on the stone steps looking down at him while fanning himself. His muddy eyes were full of mockery. He pointed beneath himself and his shrill voice echoed through the valley. You want this pile of rotten bones? Fine white-haired beast, crawl through here, and I might be merciful enough to give it back. The crowd burst into even louder laughter. Curses and taunts crashed over Joseph like a flood, swallowed him whole. Joseph clenched his teeth so hard that blood seeped from his gums. The tiger bone jade token in his mouth gave off a scorching heat that almost burned through his tongue. He looked at Mo Lao's eyes that would not close in death. Then he slowly bent down. He went to all fours. Under the spit and contempt of the crowd, he crawled like a dog inch by inch beneath Steward Wang. It was an insult colder than death when he crawled through and reached out with trembling hands to catch Mo Lao's body. Steward Wang gave a savage grin and drew his sword in a flash. A vicious cold light tore across the air. The hanging corpse burst apart in midair. Under the violent sword, Qi turned into a rain of shredded meat and blood that crashed down over Joseph from head to toe. Warm blood splashed into his blue eyes. His vision turned dark red. Steward Wang sheathed his sword and brushed his clothes with Kanti. MPT, there you go. Pick it up yourself. Take it back and feed your fellow beasts. Joseph did not roar. He did not charge forward to throw his life away. In the stench of blood and flesh, he only knelt there in silence and moved like a machine piece by piece. He picked up the scraps of meat mixed with dirt. There was no grief or fury left. In his eyes, only a dead, barren emptiness. When the last trace of humanity went out in that pool of blood, a faint thunder rolled through the bones inside his body. The beast hidden deep within him was fully waking inside that broken flesh. He gathered every last piece of flesh. Then he turned and walked toward the deep mountains. Behind him, the gate of Qingyun Sect seemed already swallowed by the blood color in his eyes. 3 years later, Qingyun Sect was in the middle of the demonic extermination assembly on the martial arena banners, blotted out the sky as famous orthodox sects gathered from every direction. Their laughter and conversation dripped with contempt for the so-called demonic path steward. Wang sat at the side of the high platform, stroking his carefully trimmed beard and enjoying the praise of the crowd. The trash who had knelt in blood rain picking up scraps of flesh 3 years ago had long since been thrown out of his mind. A heavy, thunderous rumble suddenly broke through the music. A strange figure in a wide black robe was climbing the white jade steps, 1 footprint at a time on his back. He carried a massive blue stone coffin far larger than any normal man should be able to bear. With every step he took, the hard white stone floor split open with spiderweb cracks. A crushing pressure rolled over the whole arena. Like a rising tide, the noise died at once. Where did this madman come from? How dare he come here and play ghostly tricks? Steward Wang snorted coldly and leaped down from the platform like a great bird spreading its wings. The long sword at his waist flashed from its sheath and drew a sharp green sword glow straight at the black-robed figure's throat. In 3 years he had already reached late foundation establishment and believed there was no rival for him in this region. The black-robed man did not draw a sword. He did not even make an extra move. He simply stepped forward, twisted his waist, turned his hips, and threw the most ordinary straight punch. There was not the slightest ripple of spiritual chi in that punch, only pure violence that could smash through anything rotten and dead. In its path, where the fist edge passed, the air compressed violently and burst with a piercing explosion. Steward Wang's proud sword glow was as fragile as glass before that fist and shattered into a spray of light in an instant. Then that iron-cast fist slammed hard into Steward Wang's chest. There was no crack of breaking bone, only a dull impact, so heavy it made every tooth ache. In front of the entire crowd, Steward Wang exploded under that horrifying force like a rotten tomato, smashed by a warhammer. He did not even have time to scream. He burst into a thick cloud of blood mist, and not a single intact bone remained, even the high-grade spirit sword in his hand, shaken into powder by the leftover force of that punch. The whole arena fell silent. Only the soft hiss of blood mist drifting down remained. The black-robed man raised a hand and tore off the black cloth over his head. A head of blazing golden hair burst into the wind and whipped wildly like living fire. Those blue eyes had turned into a terrifying blood red. He looked like a killing god returned from hell. "It is that white-haired beast," someone cried out in terror. Joseph's face showed no expression. He hooked one hand behind him onto the edge of the stone coffin and smashed it down onto the ground. A thunderous crash shook the arena. The coffin lid slid aside, along with a suffocating wave of blood-stench heads, with eyes still wide open, rolled out one after another. They were the 13 core disciples of Qingyun Sect who had been missing for days. The one rolling in front was the sect master's treasured only son. Joseph stood among those heads and stepped over them. His blood-red eyes swept across face after face. Twisted with fear, his voice came out hoarse and heavy like thunder. 3 years ago you said I was not fit to be buried in earth. Today I came to bury all of you. Yi Kanglin let out a shrill, furious roar, and his eyes turned blood red as he saw the heads rolling from the stone coffin, almost all of them sect elites. He slammed his palm on the table and shot to his feet, and his spirit pressure crashed toward the center of the martial arena like a collapsing sea. Kill him. Kill him for me. This blood-drinking beast who eats like a savage will be ground to dust today and offered to my son's spirit in the heavens. At Yi Kanglin, Command 7 golden core elders moved at the same time. In an instant, magic treasures filled the martial arena, and 10,000 rays of light burst across the sky. Flying swords, treasure towers, and soul-snaring chains came with destructive spiritual chi fluctuations and completely drove Ned out. Joseph figure. The air twisted violently under the dense bombardment of spells. The ground was shaved down by several feet, and the exploding dust and smoke swallowed everyone's sight. Yet, from the center of the explosions, there came a low, heavy tiger roar filled with an ancient savage presence. Joseph did not gauge and did not retreat. Relying on the white tiger bone and sinew forged in living hell, he smashed straight through several incoming swordlights. His speed was so fast, it passed the limit of the naked eye like a golden thunderbolt. Cutting through darkness, he closed in on one elder. In an instant, the elder opened a protective spell shield in terror. But before that blood-scented fist, the shield that could block a full strike from late golden core was as fragile as thin ice. It shattered at once into glittering crystal fragments. Joseph shot out one hand, and his 5 fingers locked around the elder's ankle like steel hooks. He did not kill him immediately. Instead, he let out a beast-like growl, and the muscles in both arms bulged like coiling dragons. Then he swung the 200-pound elder like a human flesh meteor hammer and smashed him into the disciples. Rushing from every side, dull impacts and cracking bones rang together across the once sacred martial arena, and woe, vive, a funeral song of despair. Those cultivators who always placed themselves above others did not even get the chance to use escape techniques before that brutal violence crushed through them. Joseph's footwork was strange and ferocious. Every step split the white jade ground, and within the chaos he precisely found the disciples who had helped dig up the grave that year. Each shift of his body brought another shrill scream. 3 years ago, you crushed my fingers in the mud. Joseph's voice cut through the screams with a terrible coldness. He snatched a flying sword with one hand and kneaded it into a lump of scrap metal, then flung it casually. The scrap iron shot like a meteor and punched through a disciple's skull. Today, I will make this whole mountain bury that old man with him in the flying rain of blood. That head of golden hair had already been dyed dark red. Joseph moved through the crowd, while every eruption of white tiger fist intent shattered another magic treasure. Qingyun Sect, which once floated in mist and immortal grace, had now become a slaughter yard of flesh and blood. At this moment, those lofty elders finally understood what true fear was. It was a man-eating savagery from the primal wilderness, strong enough to rip apart every order they had built. Tain, only to feed on men. This was no boast. It was the end of every hypocrite on this land. Joseph stood in a pool of blood, and his red eyes locked onto Yi Kanglin. On the high platform, the curtain of revenge had only just been pulled open. The sky looked as if an invisible giant hand had torn it apart by force. Yi Kanglin pressure, as a nascent soul cultivator, crashed down like a bottomless abyss. The white jade steps under Joseph exploded. At once a teeth-grinding crack came from his knees. Under the crushing weight, his bones were ground into fragments by that pure spirit pressure. His whole body was almost flat, tamed into a heap of ruined flesh. Only those deep blue eyes remained locked on the high platform. Yi Kanglin floated in the air, looking down at him like he was an insect. With a casual wave, he dropped a black soul refining tower onto the arena with a thunderous crash. The tower doors opened wide. A ragged old woman curled in the corner was dragged out by spiritual chi chains. Joseph's pupils shrank violently. She was the one neighbor in the slum who had shared half a stale cake with him and treated him like a person during his most hopeless days. The old woman was thrown into the nether-green ghost fire at the base of the tower. While she screamed in agony, her soul was stripped away inch by inch. Shach and the screams rang through the sky. Yi Kanglin looked down with a cold sneer. He said, a beast had no right to speak of loyalty. He said Joseph would watch the last bit of kindness in his life burn to ash. In the soul-refining fire, Joseph let out a howl that no longer sounded human. That sound was no longer rage, it was despair, exploding from the deepest part of his soul. The white tiger fist intent inside him began to circulate. Like madness, those bones that were already broken burst with blinding white light under the ultimate pressure. It was the last flash before the body collapsed. It was also the final gamble of walking into death to claw out a path to life-blood exchange. This was the most brutal breakthrough method within White Tiger Fist blood mist, sprayed from every pore in Joseph's body. His originally bright red blood boiled and was purified under terrifying heat. It turned into a mercury, like liquid carrying a sacred golden glow as the newborn blood flowed through his entire body. His damaged meridians were remade like dry earth, finally receiving rain, a force far beyond mortal limits, exploded inside his flesh. The nascent soul pressure that had pinned him in place was blasted apart by the blood-red shockwave. Surging from his body, Joseph vanished from where he stood and left behind only a crushed peat under his feet. Like a golden bolt of lightning ripping through darkness, he flashed to the front of the soul refining tower. He used no magic treasure at all. He spread his arms with brute force. His 5 fingers drove into the tower body. Like steel hooks, he crushed the formation core with raw power. With a thunderous blast, the soul refining tower AAR collapsed. Joseph shielded the old woman's remnant soul. Then he turned and struck with a white tiger secret art. The edge of his fist tore open the void and drove straight at Yikanglan face. Yikanglan face changed. In shock, the protective spell shield he threw up in panic was as thin as paper before that punch. Joseph's 2 fingers carried fury that could burn everything to cinders. He rammed them brutally into Yikanglan eye sockets. Amid Yikanglan's shrill scream, he gouged out those lofty eyes by force. Then his heavy punch that could shake mountains slammed into Yikanglan Dante. And there was no flashy spiritual chi in that punch. There was only violence refined to its purest extreme. Yikanglan's nascent soul shattered into pieces inside his body. In an instant, the overbearing sect master flew 100 yards like a torn sack of cotton. He crashed into the golden pillar of Qingyun Sect main hall and shattered it. Joseph stood in a pool of blood. His golden hair was soaked through with blood. He looked like a lone wolf returning from the wasteland with revenge in its jaws. Kill that beast. The earth-shaking roar rolled through the soul-breaking peak valley, and the echoes would not die. Joseph stood at the edge of a lone cliff peak. That once brilliant head of golden hair was now clumped into stiff strands by dried blood and mud. It looked like a tuft of withered grass. The mountain rock beneath his feet was covered in cracks. Those were the marks left by the bloody fighting all the way from Qingyun Sect to this place at the foot of the mountain. Countless torches linked together into a coiling dragon. The allied army of the 7 sects, numbering in the tens of thousands, had sealed this place so tightly that not even water could pass through. These cultivators, who called themselves righteous, had greed and fear written all over their faces. In Joseph's eyes, their twisted expressions looked far more like demons than the monsters in any devil cave. His blue pupils gave off a dim, cold light in the night. He looked like a lone wolf driven into a dead-end. Joseph listened to the curses rising from below and pulled a mocking smile at the corner of his mouth. The allied army feared those hands of his that could tear apart a nascent soul with raw force and did not dare charge the mountain rashly. So they used a low trick and lit muscle-softening poison smoke, downwind specially meant for body cultivators. The thick purple smoke poured back. With the mountain wind, it crawled into his nose and eroded every inch of his tensed muscles. The white tiger fist intent inside him, ENZ, like mad. But the water source had been cut off and the spiritual chi had been sealed. He could clearly feel his life force draining away at terrifying speed on this dead, silent summit. He slowly sat down behind a cold rock. He tore off a strip of ragged cloth and cinched it hard around the sword wound on his abdomen that was deep enough to show bone. The savage pain made his deeply cut face twitch violently, but he never made a sound. With the whole world as his enemy, any weak groan would be a desecration of that old man. A dark red venom scorpion with 9 segments crawled silently out from a crack in the stone. It tried to sting this outsider who had entered its territory. Joseph reached out a calloused hand and moved as fast as lightning. 2 fingers clamped precisely onto the scorpion tail hook. He did not crush it. He stared at the clear drop of venom, and a streak of madness flashed through his eyes. The righteous path wanted him dead, heaven and earth wanted him gone. Then on this abyssal cliff, would fight poison with poison. He tore off the scorpion venom sac by force. He smeared that juice, which could corrode black iron, onto the split knuckles of his fists. He let the deadly poison rake his already numb nerves, since this whole world was filled with demons. Wearing human skin, then he would become the fiercest beast in this world. And at the moment these hypocrites were most proud, he would give them the most fatal strike. The cheers from below grew louder and louder. The Allied army was preparing to launch its final assault, but they did not know that on the dark summit, a pair of bloodthirsty devil eyes was coldly watching the rot of the entire continent. In the dense forest below soul-breaking peak, the stench of decay was so thick it almost seemed frozen. In place, Joseph moved like a snake through the undergrowth. His bare upper body was covered in blue-purple poison blotches. That was the price of forcing himself to devour all kinds of venomous insects to adapt to this environment. He casually snatched a 9-segmented centipede, crawling across a tree trunk. He stuffed it into his mouth and chewed hard. The bitter piercing venom ran down his throat. It drove the white tiger fist intent into a mad circulation through his meridians. The poison was burned into violent killing intent, his eyes fixed on the massive carrion beast ahead. This foul creature born from filth carried a deadly plague poison in its blood. He used no flashy technique at all. Joseph burst forward in a single step, his arms locked around the beast's throat like steel clamps. His 5 fingers dug straight into flesh. Then amid the beast's muffled roar, he twisted and snapped its spine by force. He dragged the carcass upstream to the water source above the Allied army camp. Using a sharp stone shard, he sliced open the beast's belly. He let the dark green poisoned blood and shredded organs pour into the stream at dawn. The next morning, the Allied camp that had stood in grim order was torn apart by wails of despair. The low-level cultivators who drank from the stream began dropping in clusters. Thin black lines crawled beneath their skin. Then their flesh rapidly rotted open. They vomited foul black blood that stank of death under the catalyzing effect of the lingering muscle-softening powder. This unknown poison mutated into something even more vicious. The camp was filled with crawling wounded men and screams of terror. When night fell again, Joseph became a ghost harvesting lives. He did not use the mountain-shattering force of White Tiger Fist. He returned to the most primitive instinct of the hunt. A Qingyun Sect disciple on path. Arrow only felt a chill wind at the back of his neck. Before he could cry out, a calloused hand clamped over his face. Joseph's fingers tightened with brutal force, along with a bone splitting crack. The man's skull was pressed straight down into his chest cavity. He was no longer that foreigner who came begging for work and was humiliated and despised. He was a beast of revenge, returned from hell. In the shadows where torchlight could not reach, screams rose and fell without end. The Allied cultivators discovered in terror that their companions' corpses had been twisted into impossible angles and thrown across the tops of tents. Windpipes were torn open. Some had their necks snapped in their sleep. Fear spread through the sea, roused like a plague. Their stretched nerves finally broke. A disciple driven mad by terror drew his sword and hacked at the fellow disciple beside him. While screaming that the beast had come, chaotic fire burst through the camp. These self-important righteous cultivators began slaughtering one another in the dark just to save themselves. And those cold blue eyes watched in silence from deep within the fog as destruction born of greed and prejudice consumed them in that moment. The mountain mist seemed to freeze solid. Only the crackling pops of candle flames bursting inside the great tent could be heard. The air was thick with the heavy stink of rot and the scorched smell of blood. Firelight stretched Joseph's massive silhouette into a long warped shadow across those terrified faces. He stepped over the ground, littered with severed limbs and torn bodies. His footsteps were so heavy, he seemed like an ancient beast breaking through ice from a forgotten age. Each step crushed down on the collapsing dignity of the righteous alliance. At the center of the camp, the purple silk command tent that symbolized absolute authority had already been ripped open by a huge gash. The 7 sect masters, who had once stood high above all others, were now curled up on the ornate carpet with blue-purple faces. The lethal poison mixed from corpse poison and muscle-softening powder had already invaded their heart meridians. the vast spiritual power they once took pride in, had become karmic fire burning their own bodies. From within, the Qingyun sect master struggled to raise a trembling hand to form a seal, but Joseph moved in a single burst and appeared in front of him. That large hand, covered in calluses and scars, clamped down on the top of his head like iron tongues. There were no extra words in Joseph's blue pupils. There was only dead cold stillness. He suddenly exerted force. The utterly hard and blazing white tiger fist power became a dark thunderbolt and detonated down the man's spine. A muffled, shattering sound echoed through the great tent. The Qingyun sect master's Dentian collapsed into powder in a single instant. Then came the second. Then the third. Joseph's figure became a savage hurricane. With precise control, he shattered every inch of these men's meridians and ripped away the cultivation foundation they depended on to live. These immortal sect powers, who once commanded wind and rain, were reduced in the blink of an eye to crippled beggars who could barely crawl. Joseph drew back his blood-stained fists. He looked down coldly at this group of enemies, writhing and wailing in the mud. He wanted them to go to the very bottom of this cultivation world and taste every bit of trampling and despair he had suffered with their own bodies. Just as the pleasure of revenge was about to climb to its peak, the entire Kanglan continent began to quake violently. Without warning, a sharp giant crash came from beyond the highest heavens. It was so piercing it set teeth on edge, like 10,000 mirrors shattering at once. Everyone lifted their heads toward the sky without thinking. The ruined sect masters, the surviving disciples, all of them looked up. The originally black night sky had split open into a savage crack stretching across 10,000 miles. Countless tiny space crystals peeled away, and fell behind them was a bottomless void. This was not a natural sign in the heavens. It was the complete collapse of the laws that held this world together. Then countless void creatures poured from the crack. Like a flood, their bodies were pitch black and fluid like flowing mercury. These monsters opened greedy giant mouths and madly devoured every thread of spiritual chi in the air. The surviving cultivators brought out their life-bound magic treasures. In terror, crimson flying swords and dazzling talismans filled the sky. Yet the spells that could move mountains and fill seas struck those monsters and vanished at once, like mud oxen sinking into the sea. Spell immunity, spiritual power. Useless. The cultivation civilization that had once made mortals kneel in awe was as fragile as lambs, waiting for laughter before these monsters that devoured the laws themselves. The cultivators' shrill screams pierced the sky. The richer the spiritual chi in a person was, the faster that person died. In this chaotic wasteland, where spiritual chi was exhausted and gods were falling, only Joseph's white tiger fist intent boiled on. It was forged purely through the body and ride not the slightest trace of spiritual chi. He slowly clenched his fists. He felt the primal power surging through the blood vessels in his body, facing the direction where heaven and earth were collapsing. He released the first tiger roar that shook mountains and rivers. The black tide pouring from the crack in the sky swallowed the mountains that had once been wrapped in immortal mist. Those cultivators who had once seemed untouchable were now throwing away armor and dignity alike as they fled in panic on shaking magic treasures. Spiritual power was no longer their shield. It had become bait that drew the void monsters to them. A nascent soul elder did not even have time to let out a scream before a mercury dark shadow swallowed him together with his life-bound flying sword. After his spiritual chi was drained away, his body shriveled at once and collapsed into a dead heap of waste. Moving against this flood of rout was a single massive figure. Joseph walked straight into it. His upper body was bare, his golden hair whipped wildly in the storm wind. His blue eyes were deep as the sea before a violent rain. Every step crushed hard stone beneath his feet. The muscles across his body twisted together like forged steel. A terrifying pale gold-white sheen glimmered from his flesh. This was the sign of white tiger fist cultivated to its highest state. No spirit refining, no spirit roots, only this white gold body, hammered through endless humiliation and tempered by countless blows. Ahead of him, a void beast, over 100 zhang long, shaped like a giant serpent, let out a piercing hiss and vive toward the terrified civilians below. The monster had no solid body. Ordinary spells passed straight through it, and could not harm it at all. Just as the civilians closed their eyes in despair and waited for death, a white gold meteor crashed into the monster's head. Joseph used not a trace of spiritual chi. He simply threw a punch. That punch carried every ounce of rage and refusal to yield he had buried over the years, where the fist edge passed the air compressed to the limit and released a deafening tiger roar. With a world-shaking blast, the void beast, large enough to swallow mountains, was smashed into powder by that single punch. Joseph landed firmly right in front of the Tianyuan rift. One hand braced on the ground, the other slowly wiped dark purple beast blood from his face. The civilians behind him were stunned. They had once thrown stones at this blonde foreigner with their own hands. They had once cursed him with the crowd and called him an uncivilized beast. But now it was this devil in their eyes who stood alone before the crack that would destroy the world. Blood dripped from Joseph's hair and dyed that golden mane into a glaring dark red. He did not turn back to look at the people who had once hurt him. He only clenched those calloused iron fists again. From the depths of the Tianyuan, more void monsters were roaring as they poured out, and this beast, abandoned by the righteous path and reviled by the mortal world, held this dead patch of heaven and earth alone. With absolute dominance behind his broad back were countless living beings, still trembling in shock. Before him was the void that could devour all things in that moment. Under the blood-red setting sun, his golden silhouette stood more towering than any god statue. Slaughter had already continued for 7 days and 7 nights before the Tianyuan rift. Corpses were piled into mountains, and the foul blood stench had almost congealed into a tangible Leo red fog. Joseph's once brilliant golden hair had long been soaked through with dried blood and hardened into dark red clumps, sticking wetly to his broad back. Every punch he threw came with a teeth-grinding crack of breaking bone. That was the mad backlash of a body driven far beyond its limits. But he did not stop. The force of White Tiger Fist roared through him like molten lava. Every inch of broken bone was being forcibly reformed within that utterly hard and blazing aura. Then a roar came from deep inside the rift that was powerful enough to shatter souls. A king-class void beast, as large as a mountain, thrust out its savage head. The fangs that could crush stars flashed with a cold, ghostly light. Its target was the ruined city behind him, packed with civilians. Those cultivators, who had failed to retreat in time, were already scared out of their wits. They scrambled and crawled as they fled farther away. In the eyes of these so-called righteous immortal masters, the common people were nothing more than disposable pawns. Only Joseph, this foreigner they once scorned as a beast, still stood nailed to the front line. Like a spike, the giant beast dove down the force of the wind. It carried, instantly crushed the rock beneath Joseph's feet into powder. Joseph did not retreat. He let out a furious roar. His feet slammed into the ground, and his whole body turned into a blood-colored afterimage, shooting upward against the sky. He had no magic treasure protecting him, and no spiritual power guarding his body. He only had this mortal flesh and bone, tempered through endless humiliation. In an instant too fast for the naked eye to catch, he drove his shoulder head-on into the mountain-crushing teeth of the beast. A huge crack rang out. The bones of Joseph's left shoulder shattered in an instant. Yet with a will savage to the extreme, he actually rammed that colossal monster backward, way to the edge of the rift. On the city wall, the commoners who had once thrown stones at Joseph and cursed him as an uncivilized beast all fell into a dead silence. They watched that blood-soaked back, almost no longer human. They watched him fall again and again and climb up again and again. No one knew who knelt first, hands trembling and pressed together. Then tens of thousands dropped to their knees. Countless faint wills gathered into a pure and vast torrent and echoed across the wasteland. Joseph sensed the change. He felt a warmth of will he had never known before, pouring into every limb and every bone in the midst of extreme pain and exhaustion. His body began a strange transformation. A holy glow like white jade began to shine from inside his withered muscles. That was the threshold of sanctifying the flesh, the sign of a mortal body evolving toward a divine body. Yet this radiant transformation came at the cost of burning his soul in his blue eyes. There was only the last line of light reflected there. The fire of his life had already burned to the end. He clenched those iron fists full of cracks once more, and toward the endless darkness pouring from the depths of the rift, he threw the most tragic and most glorious White Tiger Fist of his entire life. The claws of the king-class void beast had already torn open the last barrier of the plain. The sky over Kanglan continent looked like shattered porcelain. Every bone in Joseph's body was crying out. It was the death bell tolling for the end of his life. He did not look back at the cultivators who had humiliated him, and he did not look at the mortals kneeling in prayer. He only drew one deep breath. Then, he burned the last drop of vital blood inside his body into a blinding golden flame, the final move of White Tiger Fist. Heaven and earth mourned together. Joseph let out a roar that did not belong to any human being. His back arched, his muscles broke apart, and reformed in a single instant. 2 lines of bloody tears ran from the corners of his blue eyes. His whole body turned into a burning star, and he crashed toward the black rift that could devour the world where his fist edge struck. Space shook violently. The phantom of a white tiger solidified in the void, and it released a furious roar that could shatter stars. The mountain-sized head of the king-class void beast was erased inch by inch beneath that punch. Its shrill scream was completely drowned by the blazing light that erupted a moment later. Only pure white remained between heaven and earth. The giant black fissure that split the sky was forced shut under the stitching of golden light. The violent void storm slowly calmed. When the blinding light faded, the roaring battlefield fell into a dead silence. Joseph was still standing on the lone peak at the end of the Tianyuan. He remained in the posture of a right punch. Thrown forward, his spine stood straight as a pine, as if he were delivering the final blow against this unjust heaven. But the color had already left his skin. It had turned into ancient stone. That unmistakable golden hair froze in the wind and became the brightest carving on the stone statue. His blue eyes were closed, yet the blood traces at the corners of his eyes had seeped into the stone veins, becoming an eternal mark, a Qingyun Sect. Steward stared blankly at the statue. The long sword in his hand fell to the ground. Those righteous cultivators who had shouted that they would grind the beast to dust now did not even have the courage to raise their heads and look at him directly beneath that undying pressure. This was no evil fiend. This was a true God who used a mortal body to suppress a heavenly disaster. A clear wind passed by, and the long grass around the statue grew stubbornly out of the blood. From that day on, there were no more curses on Kanglan continent about a white-haired beast. There was only a golden-haired stone statue silently looking down upon all living beings. From then on, the body cultivator path flourished greatly. Whenever later disciples passed this peak, no matter how high or low their cultivation, they would put away their magic treasures and bow to that scarred statue that still stood tall enough to hold up the sky. That was the last gentleness an outsider left to this land, and it was the most dignified curtain call won by a lifetime of humiliation.